No, it was too dark. Hi, am I live now? So once again, thank you, Karwaan. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. And thank you for staying with me. I went on a little longer than I should have. I'm waiting now to see, I suppose, I haven't done this before. I suppose I'll see questions popping up on my screen. Yes, okay. So I'm waiting for some questions to come. Doing some funny sort of. So I don't see any questions yet. Should I wait a bit? Okay. Mughal miniatures of the emperors. One sees them holding a particular ornament in their hand. What exactly is that? Okay, that's a good question. So, different things at different times. If it's the emperor, it's likely that we're seeing them holding something that they have been given. So, a lot of the interactions with the emperor involved a lot of giving and taking of things. So if you came to meet the emperor, you had to pay him some kind of tribute, and usually you would give him some rare thing, some beautiful jewel thing, and the emperor would demonstrate his pleasure by accepting the gift you had given. And sometimes, if he just gave back everything that you had given to him, saying, "Oh, thank you very much, but this is for you," it was a kind of a rejection of the person as well as the objects, that the objects are not good enough for him. So, a lot of the time, what you'll see them holding will be bejeweled objects, usually, sometimes a turban ornament, a sarpage, sometimes some other little jewel, but they'll be holding something that they have been given, which they are accepting as a mark of favor towards the giver. And typically also when they got something from a nobleman or something, they would receive the gift and then they would give him back gifts which would be worth more than what they had received. So it's a kind of a transaction. Usually you will see some kind of jewelry. Okay, so that was a question from Rohan Nautiyal, and now we have a question from Pooja Seth. Who interprets these paintings? Is the observation of these paintings discussed by various scholars to reach a conclusion? So it's interesting that we have very little literature that is directly about the paintings coming from this time. So there will be scattered references. Let's say in the Jahangirnama, where Jahangir feels that he is the greatest connoisseur of painting, and obviously spends a lot of money on these paintings and on supporting the painters, but he barely mentions a painter or a painting 3-4 times in the entire Jahangirnama. And unlike a lot of other courts, for example, unlike the courts in Iran, the courts in even Turkey, you don't have a tradition of people of the time writing scholarly texts about the painting. So a lot of our interpretation of these paintings is coming from our piecing together and putting together bits and pieces of references from here and there. So a lot of the time, it's because the painting is showing an event. You will go scouring his histories to see that is there anything relating to an event which might be what this figure or this painting is showing, and could this painting be about that? No? So scholars use small bits of textual information. Sometimes scholars use the relationship between paintings to understand the train of mind, but there is no definitive way of interpreting these paintings. A lot of what we say is actually conjectural, and sometimes there are arguments between scholars, sometimes there are lifelong feuds between scholars who just will not hear the other scholar's point of view. Jaya Basira is asking if we have any examples of paintings from Aurangzeb's period. Yes, we do. So I think that actually Aurangzeb reigned for 50 years, and for the first 20 years, he didn't shut the painting workshop. So paintings were produced for Aurangzeb, and if Karwaan will like, I can actually make a note of this, and tomorrow I can post a few paintings from Aurangzeb's time, so you can see some of them. And interestingly enough, he was a very, he presented himself as a very orthodox Muslim, and yet some of the early paintings actually show him with the same kind of halo and as a quasi divine figure in a beam of light, which later in his reign he backtracked from and said, oh my goodness, all this Jharoka Darshan and assuming that you are divine was something so impious that my ancestors did, and I would never do something like that. But in the early years, there were a lot of paintings, and a lot of the very, very skilled artists who worked for Aurangzeb, when he lost interest in patronizing them, they took their skills to other courts. And so actually Aurangzeb's disinterest leads to the efflorescence of painting in many other parts of the country in the late 17th century. Shreya Mitra says, was there any woman artist who had attended the Zanana? So the sketch I showed you from Bharkala Bhavan that was in black and white probably shows a professional woman artist. But interestingly, we have paintings which are signed by obviously women artists, but these women seem to be noble women who learned painting as a pastime or a hobby, but were amazingly good. I mean, they were no less than some of the professionals of the same time. So there was one, the first engraving, European engraving that I had shown, which had a colored version that was made by a woman artist. And there are 3-4 other women artists who are highly, highly skilled. But beyond these chance paintings that survive and which we know were painted by women, we don't know what these women did with the rest of their lives. Did they paint, like, was it a fad for a few years and then they forgot about it? Did they continue to paint? And are there many paintings that we look at today which were actually by women, but we don't know they were by women? This is not something that we have at all. And I'm not very optimistic that the documentary sources exist, that in the future we could even get to know about it. We probably won't get to know. Dushyant Singh Pawar says that the likeness of Akbar from the Aini Akbari is definitely him, but Noor Jahan's portrait is ambiguous. Is it a sexist thing or something else? By ambiguous, did you mean that the first painting which shows her hunting shows her as a male? I didn't exactly get what you meant, Dushyant. Maybe could you clarify in what way you meant sexist? And then I'll come back to this. Rohan Notyal is asking, any official efforts to bring miniatures back to us? Rohan, if you have ever been into the storage area of a museum in India and a storage area of a museum in United States or United Kingdom or Australia or even Iran, my God, the way they keep their things in Iran, you will be begging them, please take some miniatures. Because these are very, very fragile objects, and unless they are well taken care of, there's a very good chance of their being destroyed. And I can promise you that there will hardly be 2 or 3 museums in the country which actually have the proper facilities, are doing the, are keeping paintings in the kind of materials that are acid-free, which don't have fumes which damage the paintings, which keep temperature and humidity control. So really we need to enter into a contract with some rich country which is interested, which will keep our stuff for 50 years until we get our act together. No question, I'm not one of those who asks that we have to get our things back. David Duarte says, interestingly, that portraits are seen in 3/4 and profile faces, but never in front. That's very interesting. There are very, very few instances when there are frontal faces, but these are typically kept for images of idols that are being worshipped. So there are some themes in which you have people, pious people, going to temples and saying, "Look at these idols being worshipped. Look at these infidels who are doing this," and those images are frontal. So I think that perhaps in the visual language of Persian painting and Mughal painting, the idea of a pure frontal image is something that is not connected with animate beings, but is connected with carved objects. And that might be one of the reasons why we don't see a completely frontal image, or hardly ever do we see a completely frontal image. Shivangini asks, how many Mughal paintings show the lived reality of common people? Is there any evidence of that? So to answer that, Shivangini, I would say that there are very few such paintings, but when they exist, they are quite stunning in the way they touch you. So in Jahangir's time, there is a fabulous painting, which is also in Bharatala Bhavan in Banaras, which shows a mendicant, a Sufi called Sheikh Pool, who lives in Banaras, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and who has no love for things of the world. And it shows this little mud hut that he lives in. And he's this emaciated figure who is sitting on the bare ground, scratching the mud. And around him, there are common people who have just stopped to take a look at him. Usually, we see sages and saints and so on depicted when some prince or some emperor is going to visit them. So that becomes the pretext for making the painting. But in that particular painting of Sheikh Food, you don't have any imperial or royal presence dominating the painting. You just have this absolutely exquisite rendering of this man of God who has no interest in the things of the world, and just ordinary people from the bazaar. Someone is sweeping the street, someone is carrying merchandise. So that's one painting which is really wonderful. Otherwise, there are paintings which do show common people living their lives and doing their work, often in the margins of the painting or in the background. And that also becomes very, very touching to see, because it's the few instances we have of subaltern life being captured. I must say it's rather chilling to see how familiar subaltern life looks, where people are wearing simple white draped clothes, and the kinds of things they use and the few possessions they have, we see repeated in the world around us. You know, sometimes you feel there's not much movement in the last 400 years. Is there any difference between imperial paintings and the regional paintings of the Mughals? So what do you think of as the regional painting of the Mughals? I think I'm not sure I'm going to give you the answer that you're looking for. We think of the what are called provincial Mughal courts. So in the 18th century, when the Mughal center becomes weak and the provinces declare themselves as pretty much independent sovereign states, and you have Awadh, then you have Hyderabad, and you have Murshidabad, keeping a lot of the wealth to themselves, and therefore using that to also patronize a lot of luxuries. You do see paintings developing, regional centers. But when those schools start, the initial impetus in these schools is to look like the Mughal center. Because the whole point of having gotten artists and having been able to get someone famous from Delhi to come and join your court was to show that we too can do what the great Mughals had been doing all of this while we have replaced them. And so you, in the beginning, have paintings that are very, very imitative of the imperial paintings. But later, as time goes on, within the space of 10, 15, 20 years, certain regional differences start occurring. For example, in a number of these, you would see the interest in Shia themes. Then something that happens in a lot of the provincial Mughal schools becomes a fascination with the idea of the deep background. And I think it has something to do with celebrating territory. that these people have land now, and so there's going to be this infinite regression in the background where there'll be a Nawab sitting on a terrace, but behind him there'll be a river, but behind the river there'll be the other bank, behind the bank there will be fields, behind the fields there will be a faraway fort, So it's some kinds of differences that start creeping into what still recognizably looks like a Mughalish style. Pooja is asking me to share the first painting of Jahangir and Shah Abbas. So I can post that to the page today. I'll do that for you. Did the Shast or cameo undergo any substantial transformation from Akbar's time, when it was more about initiation into the Deen-e-Ilahi to Jahangir's period, and later when it may have been used to show my direct allegiance to the emperor? The Deen-e-Ilahi in Akbar's time was also allegiance to the emperor. According to Abul Fazl, the shast that he used to give when he initiated somebody into the Deen-e-Ilahi was, it carried the legend Allahu Akbar. And this Allahu Akbar is, of course, a pun because it is God is great, but it can also be read as Akbar is God. So it was a kind of a slightly edgy thing to say. But according to Abul Fazl, that is what was on the shast. According to Badauni, who doesn't like Akbar and writes the secret history of him, it had an image. And that having an image would, of course, suggest that he is promoting image worship, and he's setting himself up as God or as a deity. Jahangir continues the Deen-e-Ilahi on Akbar's terms. So if you read G.F. Richards' essay, The Formulation of Imperial Authority under Akbar and Jahangir, you'll see a very good exposition of this, where you see that it's the same terms of claiming this kind of authority and legitimacy through a divine immanence that is continued under Jahangir. Under Shah Jahan, you start having some anxieties about this almost iconophilic practice, and you have a little bit of a walking back from that. So I think at some point, I don't remember exactly, but at some point he stops the Deen-e-Ilahi. And of course, Aurangzeb stops the Jharoka Darshan. Shachi Meena is asking, there were certain paintings in which artists showed all the emperors in one frame from Mirza Shah Rukh to Akbar. Why did they want to have such sketches of paintings? Very good question, Sachin. I'm glad you're aware of this. It was for lineage. So when the Mughals came to India, Babur, let's say, he was really kind of someone from a very, a lesser branch of a grand family. So the Timurids were grand, but Babur came from a very small side branch of the Timurids and had a very small kingdom. He had big ambitions, but he didn't have any possessions that matched that kind of ambition. So when he comes to India and finds that this is the only place where he can stay, there is no long history that he can fall back on, which people in India recognize as something that they should be awed by or they should respect. And he, Humayun, Akbar, and then their later descendants, they need to actually reiterate that, publish it, make it known that we are from this lineage where there was Timur was this world conqueror, there was this great son of his, this great grandson of his, this great great grandson of his, and we are descended from this line. And the other thing is that Timur, actually having conquered Delhi in that very bloody and brutal way, the Mughals, when they first came to India, when Babur first came to India, made a claim saying that Delhi was always ours because Timur had conquered it and he had just given it to somebody to govern on his behalf, but he never gave it away. So it actually belongs to us, right? So this leaning on the lineage in order to burnish their image and to make their greatness known to all That was very important for them. Dheeraj Sardana is asking, when the migration happened from Delhi to Lucknow, for example, and the Nawabs gained more power than the Mughal princes themselves, were there similar portraits of the provincial princes as well? Yes, absolutely. I presume you mean Jharuka portraits? They absolutely were. And what is interesting to see is that the Rajputs also started making lots of Jharuka portraits of themselves. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up Jharuka Darshan, they have a very good page on that topic. And one of the paintings there is of a ruler from Marwar who is giving Jharuka Darshan. But this kind of Jharuka Darshan portrait, where you're framed by a window and you have the chick above you and the carpet below you, becomes almost like a default genre in the 18th century. And you have in different places, you have this being applied to not just the princes of provincial states, but you even start having just these beautiful men, who are just posing like this. They are framed by the Jharuka Darshan, and I'm sure there's poetry that goes along with it, who says, the press of my heart, and every breath that I take is a breath that she permits me to take. That kind of poetry, it must be going side by side with that. But I was tempted to bring one of those in. Then I thought there's enough going on in this lecture anyway. But to me, the ultimate sign of the end of Mughal dominance is actually when these pretty girls, these beauties, start being put in the Jharuka frame, so that the Jharuka Darshan, from being something that is exclusive to these divinely endowed rulers, just becomes a way of giving value to anyone that you choose to depict in it. Nachiket Saha asked, how do the regional traditions put impact on Mughal portraits? So that is like a large question, Nachiket. I also feel that in the 18th century and later, you have less circulation of these small portraits being given to people. Um, Maybe because that whole context of using these portraits, just the portrait of the ruler, um, that context is gone, because people aren't going to keep these images by their hearts, and they're not going to be doing salam to them in the morning when they can't go for the Jaruka Darshan ceremony. So that trend tends to die out, and instead, when you have gift giving and exchange, you will often have a larger portrait which may show, like suppose you're the king of Kota and you want to give a gift to the king of Bundi, you will often get a portrait made which shows the two of you together. You're going on a procession together, you're going on a hunt together, you're sitting somewhere together talking to each other. Your artist will make that painting and you will give it to, you are Kota and you are giving it to Bundi or wherever you're giving it to. Dushyant is again asking, the Abbas incident showed that face reading was not a short thing. Or was Jahangir not as good as Akbar as a face reader? Dushyant, in my modern framework, I would not think of face reading as being the best way to make policy decisions for the future. I think that Jahangir was a little bit more negligent as a king and as a politician than Akbar was. So I think that if there was a threat coming from Iran about this Kandahar and he really wanted Kandahar, he should have dealt with that issue earlier, even if it meant increasing the size of the garrison in Kandahar or negotiating through diplomacy. But he didn't do that. I have a feeling Akbar may not have lost that chance. So I wouldn't leave it just to his deluding himself with the portrait or not being able to read the face well, but a combination also of his inclination towards wishful thinking and that leading him into a problem. Dushyant is clarifying his earlier question about, is it sexist that the portrait of Noor Jahan is the way it is? He's saying by ambiguous, we still don't know what she looked like. Is it because she was a woman? And you said women were mostly anonymous. Yes. So I do think, Dushyant, that you're right, that generally not depicting women in a way that we would be able to recognize them and preserve their features for the future, I do think has patriarchy. So, and patriarchy was such an all-encompassing factor in the way society functioned and families functioned and courts functioned. And keeping asking the women to observe parda was one thing. Women were not powerless even if they were living behind walls or behind parda. But asking the women to keep parda was one thing. And another was the circulation of their image, which could sometimes go to unpredictable places. So if Noor Jahan is sitting in court, and let's say she's not veiled in court and she's speaking to her council of ministers, if there is a portrait of Noor Jahan, we don't know who will be, have the opportunity to see the book. The book might be passed around in a mehfil in a controlled setting, but when it's sitting in the library, what is the librarian doing? Who is the librarian allowing into the library? So I think the fact that images had autonomy, and actually, even if we look at the way in which the Mughals built up their library, there are instances where they are pursuing paintings that are prestigious paintings that some descendant of Timur had made, or some other great ruler whom they've heard of has made. And they are pursuing these paintings by bribing librarians in other kingdoms and saying, wo nikal do na, humko de do. So if they are doing it, then there's always the possibility of the image or their book escaping their grasp. So I think that the idea of the way these images could circulate might also have something to do with the maintenance of ambiguity for these images. That said, just the other day, it was Mumtaz Mahal's birthday, and I saw Rana Safvi and others posted a painting that is a portrait of Mumtaz. I wanted to bring that in, but I thought it'll get too long. So again, I left that out. It's an interesting question to juxtapose what are called portraits of Noor Jahan and what are called portraits of Mumtaz. And probably one could write an essay around these. Rohan Nautiyal is asking, were non-human objects commonly drawn? Many European artists drew, for example, fruits, etc. So I don't think there was a tradition of still life painting like you have in Europe. But every detailed Mughal painting has hundreds of still lifes in it. So if you were to look carefully at every inch of a very fine Jahangiri or Shah Jahani painting, you would be able to look at the endless amount of detail which is there, where you would see the vases, the cups, the tables, the clothes, the daggers, and museum curators have actually been able to identify some daggers or pieces of jewelry that are in their museum collection as being exactly the ones that were depicted in the paintings. So, the depiction is that accurate and precise. Textile historians use these paintings as a very important resource. Costume historians use paintings as a very important resource. So that just as faces are being portrayed, objects are also being portrayed very carefully. But the autonomous genre of the still life, where you just have a bowl of fruit and that becomes the focus, that doesn't develop as an autonomous genre in Mughal painting. Mobani Seal is asking, is there any Rajasani influence in Mughal painting and from whose time? So right in the beginning of the establishment of the Mughal atelier, you may know that Humayun was very, very fond of books and very fond of painting. And when he went to Shah Tehmasb's court and he asked him for military help, he also saw the paintings, the beautifully illustrated manuscripts that were there in his library, and he begged for permission to bring back some of the artists with him into his retinue. Now, what he got when he came to first Kabul and then Delhi were 2 or 3 artists. And when Akbar came to the throne, he wanted to hugely expand the atelier. He had this great desire to get hundreds, if not thousands, of paintings made, When Humayun died, he left behind a library of 4,000 books. When Akbar died, he left behind a library of 24,000 books. And a lot of these books were actually produced in the Mughal Kitab Khana. So to expand the atelier, these 2 or 3 Persian artists, who were the prestigious ones at the time, had to recruit local artists. And they recruited artists who were doing the kind of work that we often call Jain school or Chaurapachashika school or Western Indian school. I don't know if you know these exactly, but they recruited many of these artists. Abul Fazl tells us that within a short while there were more than 100 artists working in Akbar's atelier. So you can imagine like 2 Persians and 98 Desi artists. So a lot of those artists would have had not what we think of as Rajasani painting today, because that we are actually thinking of something from the 18th century, but from the late 15th century, early 16th century, the kind of styles that were there in Western India. Now, those, you can see little hints of those paintings, the way they make women, the way they make banana trees, the way they make buildings, the way they make decorations. You see some of that in the early Akbari manuscripts, which would be in the Tutinama, sometimes in the Hamdanama, sometimes you see it even as late as the Akbarnama. Rohan Nautiyal is asking, not all nobles close to Akbar, the Navratna, adopted Deen Elahi. Was this considered in bad light by Akbar, or as it was more a show of allegiance? I think this is a question you have to ask a historian, Rohan. I'm going to duck that one. Brinda Agarwal is asking, why did Mughal artists choose self-deprecating names like Miskeen, Wretched? Excellent question, Brinda, but your answer is in the question. They took these names, which are like pen names sometimes, and they took them, were they pen names? Well, one thing is that people who come from very poor families often will give their children unfortunate names. And they'll do that, to ward off nazar, so that whatever evil spirits are around don't come to steal their children away from them. So some of these names which seem to suggest that the person is lesser, or is abasing himself, might actually be given names from the family. But if Miskeen is not a given name, is a kind of a pen name or a pseudonym taken by the artist, then it could be that by abasing yourself, you are glorifying those who are above yourself. And so it's a form of flattery. It's like, मैं तो आपके चरण का धूल हूँ, I'm the dust on your feet, what would I be without you? And by increasing that subservience, you actually make a claim on the Lord, where you are so inconsequential, so incapable of being independent, that unless he takes care of you, you can't do anything. So that would be one reason why within the court you would have names like that. I must say, in the 18th century, you have pen names taken on by artists, which are a little bit like braggart names. It's the opposite of Miskeen. So you have people calling themselves Chitterman, like the master of painting. So there is a change in attitude at some point. Oh, Professor Rizavi is here. Anything on the women miniature painters of the 17th century. Professor Rizavi, we'll have to look at the Gulshan album for that, because I was mentioning a little earlier that there are these paintings, very fine paintings made in imitation, particularly of either European paintings or of some Safavid paintings. And those are in the Gulshan album, and they are signed by Sahifa Banu, Ruqayya Banu, Mimi, and so on. It seems to me that something that a lot of this was produced in Allahabad during Salim's rebellion, and that period of the rebellion seems to have been a special time for painting, where you had I'm blanking out now, Abul Hassan's father's name, the artist who ends up making the Maqbara for Khusro, in Khusro Bagh. Um, I'm forgetting his name, forgive me. But there is this artist from Iran who is the head of the atelier. And one of the inscriptions by these women artists, also, she identifies herself as the pupil of that artist. I'm forgetting. I'm sorry. I'm totally blanking out. So I think somewhere, if we could find more information about the Allahabad years, we would get something interesting about the women miniature painters. These would be, of course, the noble women who are learning to paint as a hobby. Maybe they were also under lockdown like we are and had to think of ways to occupy their time. But I think that we need to look at that little more closely. Somehow I don't see quite as much coming out from later time. You have women as artists who are working. The issue of the professional artist, which I believe the Bharat Kala Bhavan drawing is illustrating, I'm not aware of anything in the textual sources at all that would shed light on that. You know, the girls who were born into painters' families must have been seeing these materials, must have been seeing the practice of painting being done all through their childhood. Many of them would have been talented and would have picked up the skills. But what happened, where they went with them, I really don't know. It's worth trying to find out about. So I think we're coming to the end of the questions now. And Akanksha Singh says, is there anything about the animal portraits by Ustad Mansoor? So that's also a good question, Akanksha, because we know that Jahangir was a very keen observer of nature. And whenever he saw a very fascinating bird or animal or even a plant, he would often ask his artists to depict them. And what is considered quite distinctive and special about these depictions is that they are not generic depictions that we're trying to capture, oh, this is what this animal looks like in general, but that the artists had this quality of empathy when they were approaching these animals, that they came to depict the individual animal, So it was this individual zebra, this individual dodo, this individual hawk. So just as human beings are imbued with personality in these Mughal paintings, the animals also are imbued with individuality and personality and come across to us as special and particular creatures. There were, for example, there are two different portraits by Ustad Mansoor of zebras, and you can see that it's two different zebras that had come to the court. Rohan is asking, did any royal paint themselves, and are there any such extant paintings? Yes, Rohan, there is a very, very interesting painting in which it is, I think, a very likely conjecture that Akbar himself had painted a large part of it. We know that as a young boy, he was taught to paint by one of those Persian painters who had come with Humayun from Iran. And he was his student, and they remained close through that painter's life. And there is at least one painting in which a scholar has come up with a dazzling interpretation to show us that though there is no documentary evidence, this painting must at least partly have been painted by Akbar himself. For Jahangir and for Shah Jahan, we have examples of their calligraphy, but I'm not aware of paintings. Again, when we go into Rajasthan, you have examples of rulers there who are fascinated by painting and who take up the skill or the training in painting themselves. So I think we've come to the end. I've taken more time than I was supposed to, but I'm grateful to all of you for your questions and your attention. And Karwaan, keep up this wonderful initiative. It's really, really inspiring. As a teacher, there's nothing more inspiring than seeing young people with this wonderful enthusiasm and energy and deep interest. It's an inspiration. Thank you.